Today we're going to be going over some arguments on Hitler. I know it's going to be probably going to be a little bit interesting because there's most people view him as completely evil, and a lot of people even think of him as on the same lines as serial killers or mass murderers. But it kind of gets a little bit into gray areas, as you're going to kind of see. First thing is you're going to see arguments of why somebody should have killed Hitler as a baby. Now this is the most insane argument, because what we talked about in the previous one is he was fighting actually in World War I for the German army and was actually jailed. All of his ideas against Jews were really kind of founded under what the United Kingdom was doing and what their treatment was toward Jews, of especially what they saw in Whitechapel, London, and it really had nothing to do with German Jews at that time. And this was actually done after the war, not previous to the war. Another point is the fact that this was not really a learned trait of what we were seeing. This was actually from his family. This was actually something that we were seeing from him that was actually most likely from the situation of the war, and both of an animosity toward what happened with the war and what he learned from the United Kingdom, or in the case of back then being the British Empire, being the most dominant force. Now you really have to look through his life with it. Up to that point, he lost sight in one of his eyes from shrapnel during the war. He was essentially put into prison solely for being a soldier in the German army. Now the German army was merely protecting its own land. It was not an aggressor. The aggressor in the World War I was the British Empire. The British Empire was essentially being the aggressor because they were worried that another treaty between Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would have caused some other power to compete with them in the mainland area of Europe as being another superpower to compete with them, and they were not going to allow this because they wanted to be this ultimate superpower. And it was off of their paranoia that caused this war to actually blow out of proportion, and that's why they entered into the war, and that's why they got France to kind of agree to it, because France would agree, as basically France would go into the idea that they could essentially chop up land in the Middle East, and France could essentially take control of Germany by occupying it once the war was won. And France could essentially make political decisions for them, which was completely wrong, as we discussed in the previous episodes. Now, it's basically with what we saw with Hitler is it was really because of this occupation that it caused Hitler to tend to gravitate toward his only real option of having a freedom to actually rise through without having someone control him, which would have been socialism. Socialism was the only option to rise through leadership, and that's what led him to go to the National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, which is which was one of the three far left-wing parties they had. They only had three far left-wing parties available to politically choose from in the country. There was progressivism, a far left-wing party; communism, a far left-wing party; and National Socialism, a far left-wing party. There was nothing else. People may make the statement that the Nazi Party was a right-wing party, but it wasn't, because they believed in ideas like national health care, nationalized daycare. They envisioned ideas of guaranteed work with the government, and these are all ideas that have always been part of socialism. And really, when we look at it, and then we look at, really when you look at it, is the only difference is when we look at his ideas to scapegoat Jews. Well, that really comes from the British Empire when they were looking at scapegoating Jews in the Whitechapel area, and that's because of they're having certain economic and social woes within that area, and that they were getting complaints from actual citizens. And the idea was to scapegoat these people, blame them for crimes. And after the war, which happened between about around 40 years after they initially started coming to the country, and they founded Israel, and then they shipped them right off and exiled them. And this was initially, if you look in Mein Kampf, you will find the same idea of Hitler's idea was to exile Jews from Germany, which would have copied exactly what they did in England and the British Empire. So you'll find exactly the same idea copied, almost word for word, how exactly they were doing it. Now, basically, as we are going over with it, basically the French occupation pretty much created the perfect storm for Hitler to rise. And if this didn't happen, basically you wouldn't have seen him become this socialist star out in the region. He wouldn't have used any opportunity possible, like the Reichstag fire, to create the perfect opportunity to ride his way to stardom, to the top for the country's leadership. This would have never happened, and you would never have found this. And basically, is when we look at Hitler with it, his ideas were basically is to pretty much is he did not. He basically wanted the idea of state controls on companies, which really meant that he was pretty much going to, if it meant it, allow these companies to buy Jews out of the concentration camps, which meant he never really meant for the concentration camps to really be as an idea of executing Jews. This would have been his idea just for the actual usage of them for the actual production. And this is any idea of for execution would have come from other people within his regime that have been more of a stickler for the idea of a cruelness toward the actual system, and been more on the ideas of more raw socialism in its actual pure form. He would even work with other Jews that were actually within the idea of business, such as Ferdinand Porsche, who he helped work with to found the Volkswagen company to actually create a cheap automotive option for the people. Ferdinand Porsche would obviously go on to found the Porsche Automotive Company that people have known to this day. But you would obviously see many other companies be either swept up by this thing of them taking up essentially stealing companies, such as the Bavarian Motor Works, BMW, and other such companies like that, or even companies being created and taking on free Jewish labor, or whoever got swept up in these concentration camps, from political dissidents to gypsies to any other type of people, from capitalists to anything of that sort. of anybody who would oppose the system. And basically what we found was that he wasn't really as cruel as they mentioned with it, but it was more that the people who were surrounded him were usually the ones that were actually cruel on these systems. He was merely wanted to copy a lot of what he saw on the British Empire and use the basis of socialism. Now, if you want to really put the blame on something, it would be that the problems of socialism really caused what this happened. And the other people that were really hardcore sticklers towards socialism would have been the actual problems for what ended up happening. And eventually, when desperation sunk in that he was going to lose the war, that's when you were actually seeing tactics of essentially hostage crises, where they would say, basically, if you take over this area, we are going to kill these people. And that was what was happening then. It wasn't as much that it was a Holocaust-based death, but merely basically a strategic thing to keep Allied forces off those lands by threatening to kill people at a fast rate. And that was merely what they were doing. It wasn't as much of the other. Now, when it comes down to the actual ideas of what they were doing with testing and medical testing, that goes down to the cruelty nature of what you find with both communism and socialism. You'll find this also with the Soviet regime, is when they take someone into a work camp, is they don't view them actually to the same level of humans. You will find this, and this goes well beyond the leaders and people who are sticklers on those systems. They will basically say that they're pretty much nothing more than test subjects, and it becomes whatever you can do to get to the outcome. And science is more important than the actual ethics that go behind it. This is where you will find such things as eugenics, which goes into abortions, and real questionable surgeries and injections that really go beyond what beneficial science would be, with and goes without the ability to consent to whatever is being done. As far as what people can blame on Hitler with it, he can be blamed for actually not willing, rising up through this and not exiling himself to another country and trying to rise up through there. Now, since he would have been considered also under Austrian descent, he could have technically have tried to rise through the was in Austria and been an Austrian, tried to rise as an Austrian leader. He could have done that through capitalism and done it in a different way, but that's a complete, utterly a different story, and that would lead it down a whole different path. But since he had a lot of vengeance toward a lot of Europe, and he really had that loyalty toward Germany, this is kind of the story that he was put under. And this is because of what France really did by their occupation, and they didn't want Germany to rise up by having the opportunity of capitalism. This is the whole outcome that they ended up having. And because of that, this is really what happened. France and really France and Great Britain are really kind of have a lot of blood on their hands because of the situation of what they did with allowing all of this stuff to happen. If you want anybody to blame with the Holocaust, you really can kind of blame them, because if you didn't essentially enforce them to have these far extremist left-wing ideologies, they wouldn't have done this, and they would have possibly have gone right back to allowing a type of system like they had under Wilhelm II, and not have gone this manner. And I hope you like this video. I know it's probably going to be a little bit awkward to kind of view Hitler as kind of being not as what you would assume, and having to view France and England in a little bit of a negative light, and kind of setting up to a lot of the things of the Holocaust. But that's kind of the way these things worked out. Now, as we saw with World War II, we saw that basically the situation of England is they started out with Chamberlain being completely complicit in what was happening with the annexation of a lot of Europe with the National Socialists of Germany, and eventually, as Churchill came in, he had to essentially rescue it as it became a massive risk to their country. But that's basically with what happened, and they essentially were getting ready to atone for what was directly caused by what they did in World War I. And I hope that kind of explains a few things. I know it's going to be a little bit hard to swallow for a lot of people, but that's really what happened, and he really wasn't as much to blame as much as the situation that was caused at first by France and England itself. And I hope you are willing to continue listening, and I hope you're willing to come back tomorrow for the next episode. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and click the notification bell, and I'll see you guys and gals tomorrow.